Welcome back, and now for this week's Your Western with John Crockford-Hawley.
In 1845, a mere 4 years after Brunel's railway hit town, intrepid Victorians were at it again, this time trying to bridge the gap between Anchor's Head and Birnbeck Island. Local bigwigs had engaged Bath engineer James Dredge to build a chain bridge between the mainland and the island. It failed. Another loony band of local entrepreneurs then attempted to build a solid causeway from the mainland to the island, this time with a railway line along the toll road joining the main line at Puxton. It failed. Back to Birnbeck, and welcome Eugenius Birch, the doyen of British pier building. His design was revolutionary. 15 groups of wrought and cast iron columns prefabricated in the Isker foundry in Newport and then floated across the channel to be screwed in the seabed betwixt the mainland and Birnbeck Island. Because his construction was so graceful, so light, the sea had little effect on it, and for 146 years those columns have stood the test of time. Just about. This was an engineering triumph unmatched anywhere else, because unlike all other piers in Britain, this was and remains the only pier to link the mainland to an island. 5th of June 1867, and young Master Cecil Smith Piggott, son of the Lord of the Manor, is dispatched to the pier to make the opening speech. Great rejoicing in town. In those days, any opening ceremony attracted the entire population, so everybody was there, and the day was declared a public holiday. 500 guests sat down to a celebratory meal in the market house, and the market house stood where today's playhouse stands. The first paddle steamers started to arrive. The pier made its money out of the landing fees, and coming across the channel by steamer was a great Victorian tourism pastime, hugely popular. But what about safety on the seas? With more and more people taking to the water, with boating becoming more and more popular, there were inevitable risks. And in answer to these risks, we saw the establishment of the Royal National Lifeboat Institution. In 1881, the first lifeboat appeared on Birnbeck Pier. Not many years later, a purpose-built lifeboat house and slipway were constructed. They're still there, not in use for safety reasons, but you can still see them quite clearly from the landward side. For the past 132 years, men have risked themselves against storm and tempest, against waves, against mud, to rescue some 500 people. They get no money for it, they're all volunteers, and the only reward they get is the satisfaction of knowing they have saved all these souls in the past years they've been operating. Soon fairground rides, cafes and bars began to appear on Old Birnbeck Pier, much to the annoyance, though, of traders in the town, because so many people were coming to the pier by paddle steamer, they stayed on the pier. They enjoyed all the fairground rides, they enjoyed the bars, they got absolutely pie-eyed, and caught the boat back home. This really annoyed people in the town. There's something of a tradition in Weston-super-Mare. Piers catch fire. Birnbeck Pier on Boxing Day 1867 went up in flames. A new architect was soon on the scene. Hans Fowler Price. He is the man who built our original college, that wonderfully flamboyant building which stands in Lower Church Road. Hans Fowler Price's handsome clock tower on the pier is still there, just about. 37 years after Birnbeck Pier opened, a new pier arrived on the scene, the Regent Street Pier, or Grand Pier as it became known. This produced competition. Now, competition can be good for business, but when you have too many competing elements, it's not necessarily so good. And before long, both Birnbeck Pier and the Grand Pier became bankrupt. Project forward to World War II. You wouldn't think of Birnbeck Pier as being of any strategic importance, but it was taken over by the Admiralty and christened HMS Birnbeck. The Luftwaffe, on one occasion, broadcast a statement over the radio saying it had sunk HMS Birnbeck. The Germans didn't realise that all shore establishments were equally named His Majesty's ship, and so apparently HMS Birnbeck had been sunk. Well, we all know it hadn't been. But why should the Germans have had any interest in the old pier in Birnbeck Pier? Well, it's because Birnbeck Pier became a hush-hush secret establishment. This was the Department for Experimental Weapons Training. This is where Dr. Barnes-Wallis and boffins from Oxbridge came to try to create interesting new devices for warfare, one of which turned out to be the bouncing bomb. And it was the bouncing bomb of dam busters fame which reduced the dams on the Ruhr to absolute chaos and helped us to win the war. Come further forward. 1968. To most of you, that's history. To me, well, I was a teenager. 1968 really is the date by which Birnbeck Pier was in terminal decline, and terminal decline for a number of reasons. Before that date, if people wanted to come from South Wales to Weston, they came by ship. But by 1968, the Severn Bridge had opened. This meant that instead of the long drive from Wales up to the lowest bridging point on the Severn at Gloucester, people could simply pop across the Severn Bridge and down to Weston. So it was no longer necessary to come by sea. First reason for decline. Second reason is something we all take for granted now: foreign holidays. These were really growing in the late 50s, early 60s. It meant you could get to Spain for a fortnight and guarantee the sunshine, and you could also guarantee the price of your hotel would be cheaper than having your fortnight in Weston-super-Mare. So once again, facilities like Birnbeck Pier began to suffer. Thirdly, we suffered a terrible loss with the old paddle steamers, those ships which today would be tremendous tourist attractions, and we only have one left. In the 60s, there were a whole fleet of paddle steamers. They were gradually going to the knackers yard. They'd had their day. Another reason is that Birnbeck Pier was, and still is, far too removed from the town's centre of gravity. You only have to look. When the coaches arrive in Weston, people get off the coaches and they walk for what? 100, 200 yards. Beyond that, they won't go. And Birnbeck is just too far beyond that centre of gravity. And probably the most interesting and final reason for the pier's demise is that by the end of the 60s, Wales had decided to change the law. So in Wales, you could not drink on a Sunday. The entire principality was dry. So if you wanted a drink, you were a coal miner, a steel worker, you fancied a jug of ale on a Sunday, you got on a ship and came to Weston-super-Mare. Wales changed the law, and from that day onwards, you never had to set foot in England to have a beer on the Sabbath. By the end of the 60s, early 70s, this once proud old girl had become tired. Decay was setting in. Nobody was quite sure what to do with the pier. And for the decades since then, various grand ideas have been put forward. Nothing has happened. What is going to happen? Who knows? If anybody out there has access to some lottery funding, you know a very good cause.
We now welcome John to the studio.
Hello.
So you brought a little spade with you, John. Tell us a little bit about that.
What an introduction. It's a little spade. Well, actually, it's a solid silver trowel. And this was used by Master Cecil Hugh Smith Piggott, who was the Lord of the Manor's young son, to lay the foundation stone at Birnbeck Pier in 1864. So the little lad, he was only a little boy at the time, used that, heaved the first bit of cement, plopped it down, and 150 years later, the old girl is still standing as a result of that trowel.
Wow.
Or shovel, as you call it, or spade.
Spade.
You mentioned Barnes Wallis in the feature. Can
Yes.
you tell us a little bit about that and why he was famous?
Yeah, this is quite incredible. During the war, the Birnbeck Pier was taken over by the Admiralty, and it was called HMS Birnbeck, and it was used for secret weapons development work. Barnes Wallis, Dr. Barnes Wallis, who was a great explosives expert and engineer, he was there with a secret team trying to create a bouncing bomb, which of course they succeeded in creating in the end, which was used to completely obliterate the Ruhr dams, which then flooded the German industrial area below water. So it was very important. Interestingly, the Germans, of course, being very thorough, decided one day in their radio broadcast they had sunk HMS Birnbeck. They assumed that everything with the letters HMS was actually a ship. But it was the British tradition to name shore bases HMS as well. So the Germans had sunk the Old Pier.
What do you think is the future for the pier?
Future for the... Well, who knows? Who knows? I mean, do you have a crystal ball? I don't know. The poor old thing is sinking into the sea. The very reason, the raison d'etre for it being there has now gone. The Severn Bridge opened in 1968, so people no longer have to drive all the way up to Gloucester, to the lowest bridging point over the Severn. They can just come across the River Severn. People go away on proper holidays where they expect sunshine. You go off to Spain, more cheaply than going to a British resort. The Old Pier's too far out of Weston to be a hub for tourism in the town. And tellingly, of course, Wales, which used to prohibit drinking alcohol on Sundays, changed the law and allowed people to have a beer on a Sunday. So the paddle steamers, which used to bring all the Welsh over on Sunday to get absolutely pie-eyed on Birnbeck Pier, that's all changed. What the future is, who knows? I mean, it's going to cost millions to restore it. It's maybe not. Who knows?
Didn't the architect Hans Price have something to do with the pier in Weston?
Yeah, sure. The pier burnt down at one point, a bit of a tradition in Weston-super-Mare, but the pier buildings were destroyed by fire at the end of the 19th century, and Hans Fowler Price, who of course was the architect of the original Weston College, that wonderful flamboyant building in Lower Church Road, he built the new buildings, including the clock tower, and the clock tower is still there. It refuses to fall down.